Hi there. I think this is a recording. It is the 28th of February, and today I'm giving you a lecture on the Sublime. You may notice I'm not wearing a tie, but I am wearing blue and yellow, and this is actually in a weird way in honor of my alma mater, Michigan, who lost to Penn State last night and I think needs support. Um, if I haven't talked about this, I don't know why. Usually I can't shut up about Michigan with my students, and this is something that most of my classes would already have known about me. But anyway, I'm pretty pissed off about it. In some ways, it's good that I don't have more of a chance to watch the games. I slept through this one, and I think that's probably why they lost. Anyway, today we have a shorter lecture on the Literary Sublime, which I'm sure you'll be glad to not have as much content to absorb. Also, I want to point out that although I hadn't until this morning updated the fact that the Wordsworth link was going to a massive poem called The Prelude, which is actually a book-length study. I really only wanted you to look at about 20 lines from Book 6 of The Prelude. So that's been corrected on the Blackboard site now, and I refer to some of them in this lecture. My hope is that most of you just ignored that link or are going to come back to it right before the exam, which is fine. But that was my omission. I thought I had put that up and it hadn't. So, okay, here's the lecture proper, which if you're following along on the transcript, this is the time to start looking at that. A lot of our time in this course so far has been devoted to how poems do the things that they do, and how poetry can convey thoughts and emotions in qualitatively different ways than one can find in the other major genres, prose fiction, drama, the essay, things like that, the short story. This lecture is devoted to what it looks like when poetry purposely fails, and in fact fails spectacularly, to convey its message. I say purposefully because we have to assume that good poetry does what it's supposed to do. I try to stay away from doing what we call evaluative criticism. That's where you're saying that something that you've been reading is bad or good, you know, in the same way that like a book reviewer of something that just came out would make those judgments, and that would be what they're being paid for. On the one hand, the things I'm teaching you, with very few exceptions, are actually quite old. And so we have the sort of collective judgment of history and the fact that these things are still being read and taught to let us know that, you know, at least somebody has really connected with these poems on a really deep level and is willing to attest that they're good, which you know, saves us from having to make that judgment ourselves. And I actually think that's a good thing. But on the other hand, that means if something doesn't register with you on this syllabus, then it's actually an indication that you should go back and look at it again, or at least try to figure out, you know, why other people might have thought it was worth reading. Again, I want to be honest. I don't like universally everything that is on the syllabus in the same way. Some of them I like much more than others. But in an introductory poetry class like this one, you know, I feel like it's my responsibility to introduce you to a range of the different poems that are out there, because it's also true that some students are going to like poems that I don't like as much more than I do. And that's good as well. I mean, we're all different people, and you have the right to like what you like. So anyway, I would just suggest that you try to stay away from or using the tools that I'm giving you as an excuse to root out and destroy the bad poetry that you don't like. So try to assume that these are good, that we're reading, and try to figure out why they're good rather than to use this to destroy them. But what I do mean by saying that this is an instance of when poetry fails is that words sometimes fail us when the thing that is to be described is too big or too awesome or too emotional, too potent to put into language. The simplest way to do this, to have this sort of, you know, a purposeful failure, and you can do this in every genre actually, it's called an inexpressibility topos. And topos is the Greek word for commonplace. You know, topology in math, for example, is the study of surfaces. What's another one? An isotope. Well, that doesn't really help, does it? Anyway, it's a Greek root that we still see a lot in English, but on its own means commonplace. So this is a really conventional or familiar version of someone saying, I can't say this thing I want to say. In this topos, you basically try to weasel out of putting out tough thought into words by claiming that it would be impossible to do so. But in so doing, you still wind up making sure that your audience understands what you wished you could have said. Yeah? All right, some examples of the inexpressibility topos include, ready? Quote, there are no words to describe how much I love you, right? Where you want, in this case, the beloved, to know exactly how much you love them, and it's too much. You can't even say it. So even though you're protesting that you can't say it, you still wind up saying it through this convention because of the power of the convention rather than the power of language. In this case, another example: after I hit my toe with the hammer, I hopped about, trying and failing to think of words adequate to express my pain. Alas, none exist yet. Right. Which again is an inexpressibility topos, and probably not as good as I thought it was. So I came up with both of those. Both of those examples do a good job at conveying the impossible thought, thanks to this nifty convention of the inexpressibility topos. I hope that my two made-up examples also suggest that there will be a large variety of ways of claiming in words that no words exist to say what you just said. Maybe that you agree that the second one is a little bit more artful than the first, or at least not as conventional. And if you are into unconventionality, then perhaps you like that version of the convention better. Anyway, a much more complex example of the sort of purposeful failure within poetry is what we call the literary sublime, which also refers to a 90s band, by the way. So not the band, but Sublime, which is best described as a combination of immense terror and immense ecstasy. Ecstasy comes to us from the Roman critic Longinus and Edmund Burke, an 18th century English philosopher and parliamentarian, actually, came up with the terror aspect. But both of them together account for modern interpretations of sublimity. If you like, think of a feeling of joy that's so huge that it's scary. Like, for example, a first kiss on a date that goes on much longer than you intended and maybe is making a bigger promise than you wished to make. Or a feeling of terror that is simultaneously so engaging that it brings you joy, like the first big hill of a roller coaster, right? It has to be kind of under controlled circumstances, so you're pretty sure you're not going to die. But the feeling of terror, which is also commingled with joy, is a good definition for the sublime. The literary sublime is usually also a moment of aesthetic appreciation. It's where the literary comes in. So a moment of an experience of beauty, which is both terrible and joyous. But it need not be a moment spent gazing on the world of constructed art, right? I mean, you can think about it in terms of roaming through the Louvre and just, being awestruck by everything that you see and a little scared, I guess, although museums aren't usually scary. But it could also just be you're wandering around in nature and you see something which is immense and you can't really wrap your mind around it very well, much less put it into words. So the natural world can afford this sort of combination of ecstasy and terror that we talk about with Sublime, and that is why this week's lectures of the pastoral, the outdoor poem, and the Sublime are linked. And indeed, the moment in Wordsworth's Prelude in Book 6, in which he suddenly comes into view of Mont Blanc in the Alps, is certainly such a moment. And since Wordsworth, his speaker, records the moment as the climax of his poem, it's possible he wished to convey some sense of his sublime feeling to you as well, to let you experience it too. So he would have had the appreciation of the natural world, and you would have the aesthetic appreciation of his artwork. All right, so here's the quote from the poem. "That day we first beheld the summit of Mont Blanc, and grieved to have a soulless image on the eye, which had usurped upon a living thought that never more could be." Unquote. The summit of Mont Blanc is beautiful, right? And if you don't believe me, then look it up on Wikipedia. There are all kinds of images, or just on Google, all kinds of images of this mountain, and it is the tallest mountain in Europe. So I guess that's something. So there's not necessarily a good reason to look at it at this mountain and think of death, necessarily, unless you have this way of thinking about the sublime, of having terror mingled in with the beauty of the scene. The speaker certainly seems to be saying that he couldn't help thinking those thoughts, right? He was forced to think of them, usurped upon a living thought, right? He was thinking of something else, and then all of a sudden he's thinking about death because of the mountain and its awesomeness. So it's not simply willfulness or petulance that makes him think of death, but you would have too, had you been there, is the implication. You couldn't look at Mont Blanc and not have that feeling, because the natural sublime forced him to be reacquainted with just how big that mountain is, and therefore how puny, low, and powerless the speaker is in comparison. Now, many artists over the centuries have devoted themselves to packaging the sublime moment into their poetry, and various conventions have grown up around it. For some poets, at least, it's kind of like what you write poetry to do, to make the poem a vehicle for the sublime, in all of its guises. So like the tenor would be something having to do with the sublime for a particular metaphor. Contemplation of the sublime, for example, is often thought to put the observer into a somewhat vulnerable state. When you look at something that defies words, or laughs at words' ineptitude to really convey the truth of an immense situation, then you can be inordinately susceptible to suggestion or to emotional mood swings. I've never tried to borrow money from somebody sitting next to me on a roller coaster, for example, but maybe I should. Although I'm generally, pretty terrified at that particular moment, even if later on I act like it was no big deal. But on the other hand, there are literary attempts of examples of similar attempts, or analogous ones at least. There's a Henry James novella called Washington Square, for example, that I like to teach just to explain the sublime to people. That novel is mostly set in drawing rooms in wealthy New York City mansions. But it includes one scene where a father desperately tries to convince his daughter not to marry a man he suspects to be a gold digger. And he's right to do it. The guy was a gold digger. So he takes his daughter, the father takes his daughter to the Alps and basically stands between her and Mont Blanc. So Mont Blanc is behind him. It must be a really awesome mountain. I've never actually seen it with my own eyes. And he threatens her with writing her out of his will, right? And she kind of relents. It's cruel, right? Especially in terms of the father-daughter relationship. But it was an effective use of the sublime. He was aware of the fact that other people in these instances have been malleable or at least susceptible to persuasion in ways that they might not have been. She was fairly stubborn about her beloved. I guess you could also think about it in terms of, I've often heard that if you witness, this is back when we still had a space shuttle, but if you were actually present at Cape Canaveral when one of the space shuttles was launching, I have heard it said that the video recordings that the local news makes of the space shuttle launch never actually capture exactly how bright it is, and that there is, this would, I guess, be the technological sublime. It's something that defies our existing video rendering technology. There's just no way, for video capture to record exactly how blinding it is. They say it like it's brighter than the sun. It's completely white in way it looks yellow on film in ways that the observers don't really understand how it can look like one thing in person and then another. And it starts off as a bunch of inexpressibility tropes or topoi. And then as they get more and more invested, these people, into trying to describe to me exactly how much I missed out on by not being there, not only is it a little bit frustrating for me, but it does begin to more and more resemble the sublime. So the sublime is also responsible for effects of language within poetry that are otherwise hard to attribute, and you can think about metaphors that you suspect of being sublime as receptacles of excess energy that the poem really doesn't know what to do with, or because language doesn't know what to do with it. They draw your attention to themselves, and they fascinate you at the same time as being deeply frustrating, and because they repel your final understanding of what the language is actually talking about. A great example of this occurs in William Carlos Williams' poem Portrait of a Lady, in which the entire poem is about a speaker who sets out to describe a woman's thighs in various overly conventional ways, right? By using similes, like her thighs were like the petals of an apple tree, which I don't know what that would mean in terms of a thigh. That speaker is continually interrupted by a skeptical interlocutor who keeps asking questions and saying, "What the hell are you talking about? What were the thighs like?" Right? Trying to pin him down. He's trying to weasel out of actually explaining himself. And the interlocutor keeps trying to pin him down and saying, "What exactly was so enticing about these thighs? I've seen thighs before, but apparently these are the best thighs ever." The speaker can't help continuing to resort to those old cliches. This is an example of the sublime. The thighs defy language, and the speaker sees it as his responsibility to do them justice, even though words keep failing him. Whether thighs, especially women's thighs, should trigger a mixture of terror and ecstasy in a viewer, I leave up to you, but perhaps it's not too much of a stretch for your imagination. At least it seems to be what the speaker of that William Carlos Williams poem hopes as well. Okay, well, thank you for listening. I guess it wasn't as short as I promised it was going to be, but, I blame my basketball team. So, other than that, by the way, have a great spring break, and I will be in contact with you once everything has been, my plan, of course, is to get completely caught up with all grading before spring break is over, and then we will resume with the last week of Module 3, which will be another exciting round of the Fake Poets Society. So, if you're going anywhere, please safe travels, and if not, then have a good time with your staycation, and I will be seeing you soon.